Since they already got an audience, we're going to go. My name is Dan Staple. Well, actually, who are you guys? Let's start with that.
Christy Summers. I live on Third Cliff
Okay.
and on Collier Ave.
Are you on the sewer
Collier
system?
Road, sorry.
Are you on the sewer system?
Yes, we are.
And my name is Mary Alice Loring. I live in First Cliff, and I am the sewer system.
So you guys are representing residents on the sewer system.
Cliffs.
That's good.
Not really.
No, I know, but at least we get that in. And
Brad Washburn, Planning and Development Director, Town of Scituate. We're Seth and Brianna from Scituate Community Television. You're filming.
right.
Sam Bell, Resiliency Planner from GZA.
And Dan Stapleton, I'm an engineer and principal at GCA. So, why are we here? So this is actually the second meeting, and I'm going to explain to you, because I don't think you were here at the last one. I'm going to give you a little bit of a backup, but not give you the whole presentation. But I'll tell you what the purpose of the study is and what we're trying to accomplish, and then where we think it would go, what kind of life is going to happen after this. So, first off, Scituate has had kind of an ongoing program looking at resilience and climate adaptation, sort of in a big picture. So it's a coastal community. It's vulnerable to a number of climate-related issues, but in particular, it's vulnerable to coastal flooding. Those challenges are going to increase with time, primarily due to sea level rise. And so what that means is that the frequency of impacts from coastal flood events and the results of those impacts are going to increase in the future. And that has implications to individual homeowners whose property might be damaged. It has implications to the municipality in terms of the sustainability of the municipality, in terms of potentially losing tax revenue or other revenue sources, but they also have increased costs. So if you have a flooded street, for example, and somebody has a heart attack, which happened in Old Saybrook, one of our other clients, Old Saybrook, Connecticut, the town can't get to that person. That's a town service that they're obligated to provide. The cost of providing that service is going to increase. Straightforward. So the general budget of the town is going to get affected. So when we look at municipalities, we look at them in sort of broad stroke. And part of what we look at is some of the critical systems. And that's been done by others. We do it. Like I said, you've been doing this for a few years now. And one of the critical systems is the wastewater treatment plant. And it's critical for, in fact, we call it an essential facility. But it's also important in ways that may not be obvious. So the obvious ways are, people got to flush their toilets, right? And you want to be able to rely on that service. From the town's perspective, they want to be able to recover the cost of providing that service. Nothing's free. And then from a broader town perspective, when large systems are impacted, they start to impact the financial capacity of the municipality. And that's playing out in a couple of ways, but one way we see emerging now, which we think is extremely important, is it's starting to affect your municipal bond rating capacities. So you want to build a new school, it costs more money because of some of these risks that are associated with the system. So it's an important system, and that's the sort of introductory remarks, but we assisted the town with developing a grant. We'll talk a little bit about grants at the end of this program. So that grant application was successful. Sam, do you want to give just a little bit of detail on the grant?
Yeah, so it was a Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Action Grant. The town became MVP, which is known as the MVP program, and the town became a certified MVP community 2018, which gives the town the ability to apply for grants, and the town prepared an application that outlined the wastewater treatment plant based on a sea level rise study that was previously done that identified the wastewater treatment as one of the top 4 vulnerabilities.
Yeah, community resilience plan.
Yeah.
I can talk about. Okay.
And so that's what really was the driver behind the MVP grant application that outlined studying the feasibility of how to make improvements to reduce impacts from future coastal flood hazards.
So the cost of doing this study by the grant has really just been distributed to the taxpayers of Massachusetts, not just the residents of Scituate. So that's good. So the purpose of this specific study, that's how we got it, but the purpose of this study was to look specifically at the coastal flooding related, because that's the primary hazard here, risk associated with the wastewater treatment system, and what are the predicted losses associated with that? What would it cost, and what would we do to reduce those losses, and then end up with a path forward, because this is a long-term activity, long-term enterprise. So that's the underlying purpose, is to provide the town with a path forward that they can then start putting measures in place to reducing their risk. So the previous presentation was really more about the details of the hazard, how we went about doing the study, so we're not going to repeat that now, but I do have the slides if you have a question later. But that was really all about sort of determining what the risk is. And we came up with, to simplify it, there's sort of 2 primary risks. One you may have heard of before, which is infiltration and inflow into your wastewater treatment system. So you've got non-wastewater water entering into that system. And that's a bad thing because it takes a significant amount of the capacity of the system. So you're operating a wastewater treatment system to relatively clean seawater effectively. And that condition of infiltration and inflow is significantly exacerbated during coastal flood events. We know that. So that's a huge...
Is that already happening?
It's already happening, and it's a significant, in fact, the town's already done an independent study on it. And it is a huge portion of your treatment system. Operating all that equipment, all the labor goes to non-wastewater. I mean, it sort of becomes wastewater once it's going in, but it's not what's coming out of your bathrooms. So that's a huge vulnerability. And we've actually identified that from our sort of big picture view as the highest priority vulnerability. The second type of vulnerability you have is you have direct impacts associated with external flood events. If you have a pump station that's flooded, you have the potential for either putting that station out of commission for a period of time, so a disruption of service, or you have potential for damaging that. Okay, so electric equipment that gets exposed to salt water gets damaged, and then there are costs associated with trying to repair or replace it. So we have that at a number of the pump stations, and we have that issue at the treatment plant itself. So we have those direct consequences associated with direct impacts to external flooding. The infiltration, on top of taking a portion of your capacity, has got to the point now that it's actually also an internal flooding issue. And yes, that is what you're thinking.
The pump stations?
Within the pump stations, and if it conceivably were to get worse, even manholes, street, stuff like that. And potentially your house if you don't have a backflow. So I'm not I don't know where to state that now, but it is an issue. And in fact, the Sand Hills pump station effectively was shut down during the March 2018 event because of that. It was, if you walked around, you would have seen 2 to 3 feet, well, about 3 feet of water. You'd say, oh my God, it's just sitting in the middle of being flooded. But the actual impact was more from the amount of wastewater coming through exceeded the capacity of the system, and the system wasn't able to manage it, and it has to be metered down, and then that stuff's got to go somewhere, right? It's not bypassing, so it's coming up
We're
into the
not allowed
wells,
to have to the water, out to the ocean,
comes up into the Bilky first.
in the building.
Yeah. So that's a, this sort of flood-related direct impact is a vulnerability. Then the third type of vulnerability is just disruption to the service. So if the service were to shut down, I'm just picking a number, just for purposes of example, but let's say for 5 days, what would you do? Get porta john? I don't know, right? But that's not an unreal thing. In fact, the federal government is saying it was, what, $45 a day when that happens. So you're a little bit used to that with electricity, although those are usually kind of short. People aren't used to that for wastewater so much, but it's not an impossibility in this coastal flood situation. So that's kind of, those are what the vulnerabilities are, and that kind of leads to where we are today, which is really to talk about kind of a path forward. And so I'm kind of starting with the last slide we ended with in the last presentation, which is trying to translate some of this into a financial loss. And I talked about this quite a bit in the last presentation, so I don't want to do that again today. But we try and treat this in financial terms as much as we can. And this doesn't have costs related to the effects of the infiltration, but does have costs related to the external flood vulnerabilities. So it just gives you kind of a metric, and those curves are going up. The x-axis is time. And really what I want to say is there's uncertainty here, but we try and, in our business, predict these costs going forward. And then those costs ideally would get incorporated into how you look at your use fee, your rate structure, the town's general budget, the operating budget for the system. So, when you think of costs for operating a wastewater system, maybe you have to replace some aging facility, you've got to buy chemicals, you've got labor costs, all of those. Well, these are additional costs to that. But they're very real costs. While they're not as well known, because we're predicting in the future, they're very real. We do know they will happen. They'll happen with fairly predictable average likelihood over time. So part of what we have to do is really trying to get an understanding of that and integrate that into the overall sort of finances of the town, but in particular the finances of the system. So I'm going to go through these slides pretty quickly because they are a little bit detailed, but just kind of walk through the process. So once we did all that sort of risk, hazard characterization, we looked at all the impacts of each of the pump stations and the impacts to the treatment plant, and we revisited the infiltration issue that was done by a company called Smith. We start to prioritize, we start to set priorities, because we know doing nothing isn't really a reasonable priority. That's sort of the beginning of a diminished town, basically, is doing nothing. So you really have to be somewhat proactive here, and so the first priority is dealing with 4 of these key drainage areas that represent infiltration inflow, that are the primary sources of your infiltration inflow. And we move down to looking at making some of the pump stations more flood resistant, hardening. We're doing the same with the treatment plant. And then we look at other options that we have in addition to infiltration and inflow, in addition to that number 1, to kind of manage overflow. So, yeah, you may have a question.
Yeah, what does harden mean?
Hardening could mean that if flood waters would rise to the point where they would get through the door, And then the door, it would start dealing, impacting systems inside the pump station. We would put a water tank door,
You would put a what?
like a water tank.
You wouldn't have to try to raise the station?
Well, that is a form of hardening, but that is a very expensive
Yeah,
form of hardening. Because these pump stations are about $2 million a pop. So we are trying to be efficient in how to do that. So that's a good segue. So part of being efficient is to take a phased approach, because us presenting slides or even reports is completely pointless if it's not likely to be implemented. I mean, we just won't. There are a lot of engineers who just throw numbers, but for this to be successful as a town, it has to be sort of implemented. That's part of what we see our job. So we realize you're not going to do it all at once, because that would just mean you would do nothing. So we take a phased approach, and actually I have the slides in front of me. I don't know if you can look at that. So how do we look at phasing? So really the goal, it's basically near term and long term, and I'll talk about what that means in terms of years in a few minutes. But our immediate goal is to reduce the risk within a reasonable price point that can be done in a near term period, in a few years.
What does the abbreviation I/I?
So that is infiltration and inflow. That's all that water coming into the system. And so how do you reduce that? Well, the town's consultant, C.M. Smith, has laid out, there's a whole report on it, but you're really talking about things like replacing pipes, picking them up, replacing them. You're talking about eliminating sources which are usually often right at the house, maybe even on private property, that are putting water into that system. So if you have leaky pipes, you want to replace those, like the clay pipes. If you have, let's give you an example, if you had a roof leader from your roof drains that you just have hooked up to the sewer system, that's a source that you would want to eliminate, right? But all those add up, and they add up to millions of gallons. And when you have houses that are close to the shoreline, they're actually groundwater tidally affected, so it goes up and down with tides. That's causing infiltration and inflow. But if you have a leaky pipe, but if it goes up high during a flood event like the March of 2018, which went up to elevation 9, that's a lot of water going into those lines. And then if you add on to that, then portions of the neighborhood got flooded, and it's now going into the surface sources, it's going into like non-water type manholes. All of that is dumping a lot of water into this system for that event. That's infiltration inflow. So you probably don't want to go through each of these measures. There will be a report. I mean, I can, but I think Brad's going to want me to move along here. So we've got sort of a near-term approach, and really the takeaway for you here is this is trying to reduce the near-term risk. Okay, so that March event was effectively, if you can look at your risk as a hockey stick, and that risk being the performance of your wastewater treatment system, that March event was right at the cusp of the whole system kind of collapsing. So it was managed, not easily, but you go a little worse than that, where you get several of those back to back. That's the point where we know the system's going to start to shut down, and you won't have access to your use of the service. That's where we're at. So that's a real risk. You've experienced it, you've lived it, you can kind of see what it is. That's near term. Then we have a separate set of strategies for long term. And the long term strategy really is, there is an industry guidance now. Well, it's an industry guidance for people who are in the business of designing wastewater treatment systems. That guidance now has specific standards relating to climate adaptation, flooding resilience built into that guidance. It's very effective if you were to build a brand new system from scratch, but we still try to achieve the intent of that guidance to the extent practical for existing systems. So that's obviously more money. So that's a longer term strategy, but it is a key strategy. going forward. Because the short-term strategy will reduce your risk in the near term, but if you want to extend the life of this whole facility for 35 to 50 additional years, it's going to be a long-term strategy. And a more expensive one. So, what are some of those? I'll just kind of go through some of these measures. So, really infiltrating this infiltration, but there are 4 specific areas that are key. Those are the areas in red. These are the highest priority. And I don't know where you guys look at that because I don't know street by street, but you know these are key areas right here. Those are high risk because they're contributing a very large proportion of the infiltration into the system. So they're affecting all the other users of the system, even though they kind of represent a small portion of the users. So, you know, one thing about climate adaptation and coastal resilience is it's not a uniformly distributed risk or loss. It's very sort of geographically focused because those are the areas that get flooded. So if we use your FEMA flood map, we can kind of see who's, and the red outlines are the system. So you can kind of see who's in it, who's out of it. So here's, you know, kind of some examples. Flood door, this is near term, kind of parking type of thing. Water bed hatches on the wells. A lot of these have external wet wells. You can kind of see, that's that.
Could you go back to the picture? So where was the Mark storm?
It was about 10, so it was right at that landing. So it, like I said, you know, it looked like massive because there's water everywhere, right? They got to it in a rowboat to get into the building. But it had just started to reach the point where it would have started to go through the building and the events, and you have a lot of other penetrations. So, but that was an issue that had so much. If you look at this flow chart, which is a little bit, I have different versions, but that was here, and basically all of these go into that.
So I'm just trying to think about, you know, this happened in March of last year where it was pretty close to getting in, and you're going to harden these structures so that they won't have this risk. But over time in the future,
Yeah.
won't the water be higher
Yeah.
more frequently? And is that
Yeah, that's a lot of what we talked about.
Is that a long-term
In
strategy?
the last presentation, but no, it's a very valid question. So you have a flood risk today, and that flood risk in our world we describe in terms of probability. So a 100-year recurrence cyclical event is a flood that has a 1 in 100 chance of being met or exceeded in any given year, right? Over a period of 30 years, you have about a 1 in 4 chance of meeting or exceeding that flood. So it's just a numbers thing. But when you have an increase in sea level, the 100-year recurrence interval flood today, in 10 years might be a 20-year, that much more frequent, right? So all those numbers start shifting, and then your potential for impact, your frequency of impacts, and the costs associated with that start going up. So in the near term, we just want to minimize the risk today, but we want to do it at a lower cost, like using deployable measures, not elevating a pump station for another $2 million. When we look at the long-term strategies, we're really trying to comply with those industry standards, which we will take sea level rise, and we project that out within reasonable estimations of that, and then bring that into account in terms of the measures that are done in the long term, which are going to be more substantially expensive. Does that make sense? So your good question. The answer is yes. You have to account for the future.
I think what I'm curious as to what's the breaking point where, you know, I mean, obviously taking some relatively cost-effective minimal measures now to prolong the life, but are there alternatives, you know, to just spending more money on the same systems that might not last when you could divert that money to systems that would be more long-term?
Yeah, so a sort of very simple example would be just what we talked about, a pump station. If we want a near-term solution, are there, everything here is expensive, but I'm going to say reasonably cost-effective, so we could do some simple measures, deployable measures to reduce the risk. And maybe not even to this 100-year recurrence, just to reduce the high-frequency risk, because that's what we're trying to do, is not have the system shut down in the next few years.
Right, you have a short-term problem.
If you go to a long-term, then it's a sort of analysis where you could say, well, what's the age of that pump station? When was it last, upgraded? Because it's not just the external building, it's the systems inside the building that are a big part of it. In fact, they're probably the bigger part of the cost. And so we have two that are quite old, and the rest are fairly new, at least the ones that are vulnerable. So if that becomes a sort of cost analysis, do we replace those or not? And that's part of sort of the decision process going forward. Now, that's a simple example. You could extend that to your entire wastewater treatment system. And that in turn becomes more complicated because more people want to be part of that system. And then it becomes not just Scituate system, it can conceivably be a regional approach. And there's a whole sort of long-term planning piece that we're going to talk about in implementation at the end on how to deal with that. So, but it is a very valid question. You don't want to just throw good money after whatever that expression is, bad. I can't remember what that expression is. Throw good money after something bad.
Bad.
Yeah.
This study also includes long-term measures as
Yeah.
well. So it's not just looking at short-term, it's looking at both.
So here's just, like I said, some kind of near-term stuff. Some concepts. See, even the near-term stuff is expensive because it's an expensive system. So these are just some near-term things. I'm probably going to get into the details of these, but reports.
I would like to hear a little bit more about this.
Okay. So it's a little hard for me to go into a lot of detail because you didn't have the background from the last presentation. But so basically, let's take this slide right here. So everything here is about elevation relative to flood elevation. Okay. So it's about the elevation of the ground surface. It's about the elevation of the equipment. It's about all of these things in a treatment plant. So when we go into that, we create a kind of discrete spreadsheet that identifies each of the major systems and components within that. And then we look at the elevations of each of those components, we understand how they operate, and then we try and assess their vulnerability. Okay, so here's a pump station. This is just one pump station. We do the same thing for the treatment plant, and so we go through, we itemize inventory all the components and systems. We understand how they operate, which ones will shut the system down, for example, versus which ones just, not a big deal. And we look very closely at sort of flood hazard. So part of that is to try and sort of assess that flood hazard. So we don't just go to a FEMA map, we try and break it down into a little bit more discrete than that. And this is just a summary table, but for the treatment plant itself, we have for each of these rows, we have a detailed table. It's just,
I get it.
So it's that kind of understanding the system, which is all these little pieces, understanding the vulnerability of the system. That's characterizing the hazard, the flood hazard, and applying that hazard to the system. And then it's predicting the losses that come out of that. And then we amortize those losses. We take another step. This is from the last week's presentation, but here is I showed you the details of sort of the buildings, right? But all of those now play into a broader system, which is the quote collection and treatment system. So this is a conceptual model of that system, if you will. So all of the houses, your houses fit into one of those boxes. And one of those boxes fits into a pump station. And this looks at how all of that's connected. So why Sand Hills is such a high priority system, like I pointed out, is all of that has to go through there to get to here. Even if that's not impacted, but this is shut down, unless the town spends a fortune and bypasses the system on an emergency basis, nothing from there is getting through because this is now shut down. So that's sort of the next level, is to look at it very discrete level, component level, and then try and look at it as a system level. We do kind of both of those. We do it this way to try and prioritize. If you have X number of dollars in the near term, that's politically, that's what can be done. Then where do we spend it? Do we spend it here? Well, yeah, I guess the homeowners there would love that, right? But I just count the numbers and look at, relative impacts. I'd say, no, we spend it in here, right? Because that's got the biggest bang for the buck, if you will. And then eventually we get to here. So that's sort of the process of prioritization. Is that like too little, too much?
I thought we were talking about the outfall and the treatment plant itself.
Yeah, okay, well, this is sort of the big picture, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so now you're going to kind of get into a little bit of the details here.
I just wanted to hear what modifications you were thinking about here.
Yeah, so these are near term, right? So I got a few things here that we're thinking about. Look at D there, right? So these are sort of the lower hanging fruit. And there's some kind of funkiness. Are you pretty familiar with this system? You sound like you might be.
Yeah, I'm the director for the Watershed Association.
Ah, perfect, okay, yeah.
So,
Were you here last?
I'm sorry?
Were you here last time?
No, one of my staff was.
Okay, great, all right. So some of these are kind of straightforward, so you have stormwater outfalls in the estuary. Those, they don't have gates, you can get backflow into the system itself if you get high water elevation. So that's kind of a one-by-one key issue. The effluent outfall is a little bit of a separate issue, which I can show you in a picture, what we're thinking. But the big sort of picture items here is a deployable perimeter barrier, which in the near term means a lower cost one, so a lower height one, and then also the use of the lined lagoon itself. So what that means is, right now, we would be looking at least what we're pricing out, is a deployable system that would act as a perimeter flood protection on the plant itself. So it's not necessarily a longer-term system. It may become integrated into a longer-term system, but we don't have the operational capacity to install 1,000 feet with the staff prior to a flood coming, because we just don't have the manpower. So we would probably select a deployable system that's semi-permanent, like a aluminum stop-lock system. But they could set it up, it's not going to get like UV degradation over time, but it's still flexible enough, like when they do snow plowing, they can take out whole sections because they push the snow out. So is that the end-all flood protection for the plant in the long term? No, because it's probably not going to be high enough. It's not going to be substantial. But is it a short-term solution to having the settling tanks flooded, which will shut the system down? So, it's kind of an iterative process that, which I think from your background you would get immediately, but we have to go through the spreadsheets like one by one to show you. But that's a concept. And the other big concept is sort of this lagoon. And so the lagoon's a little bit complicated, particularly because I don't think anybody who designed it is still around. But I will tell you what I think from looking at the drawings, that this was intended to be an overflow capacity support system. So we talked about the infiltration and inflow being a problem, so that's a problem at each of the pump stations, because those individual capacities can get overwhelmed to the pumps, but it's also a problem for the whole system by wastewater, the quantities of wastewater coming down into the system. And if you look at that, Brad, you can tell me to set up anytime you want. It's getting too late. But right there, that yellow line is sort of your maximum flow capacity for that system. And this is the month of March in 2018, and you can see where you're starting to exceed it. So, ideally, you don't want to be discharging that to the estuary. So you could have, that's by the way Sand Hills, and that's your Grantmere operator, bravely facing, earning his money there. He's an amazing guy, by the way. You guys are very lucky to have him here. So back to this lagoon system. So this was originally constructed, I believe, as an overflow capacity system. I think that the way it works, sorry, it sounds a little vague, but you can see this is one of our recommendations from additional study, is right now, within the plant itself, you have a hydraulic gradient that has to be met. You have a series of pumps that constantly control the heads in it. Those series of pumps and that gradient are dependent on what the elevation is right here. When that was upgraded or designed, it had to support a 100-year flood elevation. That was a 100-year flood elevation then. So if that level goes up now, that starts to have a effect backing up to the capacity of the whole system. And right now, it's set up, I haven't shown on this plan, but there's a connector to the discharge here, pipe, riser pipe, which would spill out into the lagoon. And then in the upper right-hand corner, you have the ability to, that green line, to bring that, wastewater back into the system.
So you could take the overflow and retreat it,
It gets treated, so it doesn't get discharged.
so it doesn't get discharged without full treatment.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, we have a little bit of an issue from a flooding perspective because the existing perimeter dike is at elevation 10. So, that's one of our issues. We don't deal with it in the near term, which is just the next few years, but in the long term, we have to absolutely have to deal with that. There's no point restoring the lagoon if you can't, if it just gets filled, right? Because it got overtopped.
Do you know if the lagoon is being used now?
What's that?
Do you know if this lagoon is being used now?
No, and it's had a lot of UV damage. It's probably its replacement. That's what we're proposing. So to make this functional, so there's it all comes back to this issue of capacity. So when I show you some numbers for infiltration and inflow, you're going to be surprised how expensive it is to fix that. And so part of this thinking, the thing is a little complicated. So we don't do this in a vacuum, by the way. We do this, sort of part of other consulting groups that are working on the plan. But let me just throw out a couple scenarios. You can't fix the infiltration and inflow to the extent we would like in a reasonably near term. Can we partially take care of that problem through putting some of the money into restoring this and actually making it work as an overflow? If that's cheaper, then not. But we have to balance that. This thing is flooded too, right? So, but that's the kind of sort of thinking that goes through to doing this. And then I'll show you in a minute. We haven't even sort of expanded view of that thinking, but that's probably way down the pipe. So, it's really looking at that hydraulic gradient, looking at the hydraulic gradient in the context of these new inflow numbers, and looking at it in the context of a higher elevation here associated with the flood, at least with the 100-year flood event. And then understanding how the system works. If we get past that, then we look at the actual condition of the liner, but we're pretty confident we will be looking at a replacement, and then just using that as an overflow capacity. Now, let's say you do all the infiltration and inflow work. All that money, you get a bond, you do it, boom, done. Tight pipes everywhere. Now you're going to want to expand the system, so then it will take a different kind of light in that expanded surface area. So, and then you have permitting issues that drive capacity. So that's kind of that's an individual element within sort of a near-term solution. Some of the piping issues, which I think I they're a little bit, there's kind of a mashup. So we have some stormwater. We have an issue that we've sort of bundled in here, which is right now there's a lot of instrumentation and electrical that's underground, and it's got leaky manholes, but they're also they're really aging now, and they're service problem as they are. So we've thrown those in here.
How long has this plant been in operation?
Originally 60, I should know that off the top of my head, 66. It's pretty old. Yeah.
It's over 50 years old.
Yeah. But there's been upgrades. There's been 2 major upgrades. The plant itself actually works pretty well. It's just got so much water coming into it that it's exceeding its capacity. So that's why that's a number one priority. And then we have a kind of funky situation with that pond down at the other end. So we have a stormwater line, that's a yellow line, that has a gate valve here. So it can't go out, but it can go in. So that's a minor thing, but that's got to kind of be thought through. So that's a sort of lower hanging fruit, but this is the bigger one, and the perimeter protection is a big item. So there's 2 general approaches to overall long-term, near-term. You can deal with flood protection on a component and system basis. So we put, all of these hundreds of systems within that plan to try and harden all the ones that we think are vulnerable. Or you can do a perimeter flood protection. The majority of municipal wastewater treatment plants that I'm aware of in the Northeast that have a riverine or coastal flood hazard are dealing with it through perimeter flood protection. They're building levees or dikes. We can't really do that because we don't have the footprint, and we have some other issues, or flood walls. It's been the predominant approach. Yes?
Maybe just, I'm sure you come from this, but, so you're building walls around the edge of the treatment plant structures to keep the water from coming in from coastal flooding, but you're building a lined storage area outside of this that you'll discharge partially or untreated sewage to, and then the flood waters will inundate that, and then they'll come into the river. Is that the plan?
Yeah, and you're being, it's good to be a little skeptical. So part of this cost is to do some modification to the dike, but you're asking questions that have detailed answers. So part of this is the dike itself is not geotechnically suitable to just increase it 6 feet tomorrow. The dike I'm talking about is this low perimeter berm that
Between
surrounds
the marsh and
the lagoon.
the lagoon.
And it's
Man-made.
around elevation 10.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can imagine the flood there was pretty close to 10 in March. So right now, if that exceeded and flooded the lagoon, it probably still wouldn't shut the plant down because the plant's higher. So we're up around 11 to 12 here, and then when we actually get the system components, we have another few feet. So the plant's not quite as vulnerable in terms of, it's vulnerable in terms of the impacts, but it's not elevation-wise, it's not as vulnerable as the lagoon. So if we repaired the lagoon now, we would probably try and get some improvement on the dike to get another foot or so out of it, but that just becomes a cost analysis.
Okay, I'm just still trying to, if we're having a storm, water's coming into the pipes, right, from the sand hills and from the other areas, and at the same time, we're having some coastal flooding here, and yet you have to release water somewhere, and that's what this storage
Yeah,
is supposed to be, but yet it's potentially underwater.
because it's not a binary. In the near term, we're trying to reduce risk. We're not trying to reduce all risk. We're trying to reduce some risk. So if we were to increase that elevation to 11 on that dike, that turns out to be feasible from a cost perspective. Our ability to use it as an overflow capacity system is only as good as it not being overtime. Obviously, because then we have it under control release, right? So, but if we have a 10-year flood or a 50-year flood, where we still have a large infiltration inflow, for those occurrences, you could still utilize it for that. So there's a management component to this. The system is not a passive system. It's not a passive system today. The operator has to go meter down each of those pump, well, not every one of them, but several of those pumps in the pump station to meter the flow down. And he's effectively using the entire system itself, the pipes, as a storage unit to do it. So there's a lot of active management. This is just another element to that. But if you were to look long-term, and you still want to continue with this option of having an overflow system, then you probably be looking at a much more aggressive perimeter flood protection system, which I think is addressing your concern, which is if we exceed that elevation 10 or 11, now we're going to have a system that protects, somewhere up to like 18. So the whole system is protected in its entirety.
I'll read the report. I mean, I would, the first question I have is what's the differential between the cost of I&I, I'm sure, to this?
Yeah.
'Cause
And that differential.
you're putting the risk on the river rather than
Yeah, and that differential
financial
shifts
input to
with the overall. So the capacity is a very dynamic thing. So right now, if you had no new users, we know what the infiltrate, we have a pretty good idea what the infiltration inflow is, and we know what the normal use is, right? So that's in CDM Smith's report. And then you just come up with a number and you try and support that number. If the infiltration and inflow number gets reduced, then your capacity of your system goes up proportionally. That dynamic shifts a little bit when you start adding new users. You really can't add new users unless you create capacity. You can create capacity by reducing your infiltration inflow, or you can create capacity by building a new plant, or another, a substantial increase in capacity plant, and then you get all that permanent. So, but the overarching concept here, beyond damage, and maybe I should have right from the get-go mentioned it, obviously part of the losses are unintended releases, or unintended, untreated release. So that's a loss. It's not as easy a loss for us to environmentally, financially assess, but it's still a loss. Permit's only going to support so many of those.
So this long-term solution would raise the elevation of what you called the dike, now it's a levee?
Yeah,
Is that-
but we couldn't do it with the levee.
With the-
Because we're right up against well, a number of things we want to watch for them. So usually these are, kind of think of like a chain link fence, right? What that looks like gives you kind of a frame of the height and dimensions. Typically this would most likely be like a steel sheet pile.
So that's going to be visible from the river too.
It will be visible. Yeah. To the extent that it's visible. I mean, you can try and vegetate the outside.
River zones
and
in the drain.
Hmm?
May I ask a question about the current treatment plant that you're planning on these improvements, suggesting these improvements to? How much longer, how much more capacity does that treatment plant have? Because we're building all these multi-unit buildings.
Yeah, that's probably, I'm not probably the best person to answer that question because that's been a different analysis. But I can tell you more immediate issue is probably close to zero because it's being driven by not the normal use. You do have excess capacity, and normal use is being driven by this condition right here, which I had that yellow block there, this guy. Right.
Your peak.
And that was probably, our best estimate was that was like a 30 to 50 year recurrence if you look at it today. So maybe,
But the additional building and, access to the sewer system, the whole system with new buildings, and new homes, is only going to make that situation worse.
But you deal with your II, I don't know these numbers off the top of my head yet, but I think I might have it on.
So we want to have a wastewater treatment plant to treat sewage. We don't want to have a wastewater treatment plant treating ocean water. So we have about 25 to 30% of our, and that's an estimate, it could be either end of that figure, that we're treating stuff that we don't want to be, again, whether it's rainwater or seawater. So for projects like the few that you just mentioned, the town applied for and received the Mass Works infrastructure grant to do the I&I
Some
work
of this
that,
stuff.
yeah, sort of replace the sewer pipes out at Cedar Point.
Yeah.
They're doing an additional study, but the hope is that, we can get those pipes replaced. They're some of the oldest, services. It goes down to a 50-year-old vitrified clay pipe that's probably underwater on a daily basis, and then when you have these flood events, that's even worse. Again, that same type of construction methodologies goes up and down the coast, Oceanside and other areas. So all of those areas are sucking in a considerable amount of water. And yes, when we fix those, we want to expand to areas that we've already said, sewers coming your way. We have existing residents that we promised to provide connections to. And then, just for example, the transit-oriented development down at Greenbush, those are the kinds of projects that the town wants to see, and that's actually the project that the town leveraged to get the money to do Cedar Point. Not have that kind of smart growth in the right places, but again, so that's the trade-off. Is we are going to replace. We want to get the seawater and the infiltration out of the system, but we will replace it with sewage. But again, we have to ensure, we have permanent capacity at our plant. We can't go over that. So essentially, any new development that comes in has to carve out the capacity that they need within our system, because we have so much of this I there right now.
Yeah, your shortest path to increasing the number of users is to deal with the II action, because that frees up a lot of capacity without building, new treatment, investing into that. Once that's done, and then so right here, you fix that, you're down here, so you have a lot of excess capacity. And new users, eventually you're going to get back there, but then it's different.
Brad, is that possible to get 30% reduction in II? 100% type, is that what your aim is?
Anything's possible with money.
Well, yeah, right, and so
that's
is
the
building an
goal.
18-foot wall along the river.
That's the goal of Cedar Point, that type of project. We've got a sealed system typically is better in terms of not allowing II in the future. So to do a project, II removed project in Cedar Point and all the basins that were identified in the CDM Smith report, I don't know if we'll always get everything. I think that will get the majority of the identified leaks in our system out. We can address those 4 or 5 priority areas.
Is there a standard, industry standard for a percent II in the system? Just like they have in a water? Yeah, pipes are never going to be 100%.
Yeah, but if you're, well, I don't know if it's publicly available, but CDM Smith's report gives a pretty decent breakdown. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit there that can be dealt with. The industry standard, I think I had it.
Is it like 10% like it is for
No,
water?
it's not written quite that. It's very broad. It's I got it here. That's not it. Piping and flow can be protected during wet weather conditions within a 100-year floodplain. So, it's not a numerical standard. But a lot of the, I can remember what the
So that's a graphic from the CDM Smith report that breaks it into the sub areas. And they quantify per area, the approximate amount of II per day per coastal storm event. So again, no, we'll never get everything because we're not going to really be addressing areas outside the flood zone that could still be, leaky pipes. But I think we could get a large amount of that kind of quantity per day if we address those areas.
And so that kind of get back on track here. So, I just want to say, it's not like a, investor in flood walls, but, and in fact, a lot of what I do for a living is actually working on natural energy-based systems. So, but the reality is with wastewater treatment, here's an option: build a new plant. Is it a real option practically? Probably not. So if we want to use the plant we have, then you can't ignore that it's going to get flooded. So your options to protect it become less and less. And wastewater treatment plants, for better or worse, like I said, in the Northeast, primarily using perimeter flood protection. So the Warwick Sewage Treatment Plant, Warwick, Rhode Island, significant riverine flood in 2010. They had a perimeter levee, expanded the height of that levee with the dike. Fairfield, Connecticut now is looking at developing a perimeter flood wall around their wastewater treatment plant. We're involved with Stratford, Connecticut, looking at expanding a perimeter flood protection levee, probably by using a sheet pile flood wall into what's already an existing levee. So the reason we're seeing so many of those is because there are not a lot of other choices. We can alternatively go and try and protect every system, like settlement tanks. We can go and reconstruct higher walls around those tanks, but you're going to quickly surpass a price point that's going to be practical, because this, at the end of the day, is going to be funded by the users, basically, and that's the reality. So what we do try and do is, if we do something like this, we try and do it as aesthetically pleasing as we can, and do it as practically as we can. But you just start to sort of run out of options after a while without building a new system in its entirety. And that's just, you know, we're obviously not replacing the entire treatment and collection system, so, you know, are we elevating this plant 8 feet? Not likely. That would just be an extraordinary cost. You'd have to shut the system down and reconstruct it. You might do that for a pump station, but you're not going to do it for an entire treatment plant. So we kind of got what we got, and we just go from there. But the good news is this is not by any means the worst we've seen. They put effort to design into a 100-year flood historically. So some of these are much more flood prone than this. So then we kind of, this is a minor detail, but this is linked into that hydraulic gradient, which is linked into the overflow of the lagoon. We may need to increase our hydraulic gradient capacity. We can do that with an additional pump. And one sort of concept we're looking at is, but this is sort of long-term, but we were asked to at least bring it in, because I actually am kind of intrigued by it personally, but we don't have a large volume here. But the basic idea is, can you now, if you're going to have an overflow system, can that overflow system act as a constructive wetlands to get that kind of secondary treatment? And so we see kind of a range of these. This is the basic concept. So if you ignore the left part of this, which is your treatment plant, just look at the right part of this. It's really, you still have a mined facility, but you create a wetland system within that mined facility, and that wetland system would be used to get secondary treatment prior to discharge, and it could be also, you still have the opportunity to bring some of that back into the system the way it's set up now. So there are some good examples of that, and I think this is something we're going to see more of. I mean, this is a site in North Carolina that actually has created the entire treatment system around this approach, so it's actually uncreated effluent going into the system. But we're really that green field at the top. That's what we're talking about. So we don't have a lot of capacity in that line lagoon, so we have some versions of this that actually channelize natural estuaries and utilize those sort of cordoned off components of a natural estuary as part of the treatment. So there are some options, but we kind of see that as the long term. We are still trying to, we have another week or so on this. We're trying to refine some of these numbers, but I wanted to show you some numbers just so you can sort of get a general feeling about what this is. So about 75 to 80% of these costs are really the infiltration system, the infiltration inflow issue. So that's that top line, and so that's phased into 2 phases. The first phase are those 4 high priority areas, and additional areas identified by C.M. Smith. These are the costs associated with those areas. And then the other things that I've talked to you about go into those other rows, and you end up with a general cost of about 22.5 to 32 million that has to be brought into your both your operating and your overall system costs.
That goes to operating, not
A little bit.
construction?
Yeah, so I'm going to get to that in 1 second. So I'm winding down here. So there are some additional studies that we strongly recommend. The first two of these are fairly straightforward since they've already been done. But one of the things about our resilience practice, or anybody's resilience, we don't want to do this in a vacuum. It's only going to be successful if we integrate it into what's already going on. So you've already done this infiltration study. We didn't feel like it fully captured some of the coastal flood, so we want to see those numbers adjusted. It's not going to be that hard with the input we've developed here, but we want to, it'll revise those infiltration and inflow estimates to more better account for some of the coastal flood. Component to that, you've done a detailed study relative to rate increase for your wastewater system, which is a good thing to do. But we would want to make sure that within that analysis, we start to include some of these climate adaptation resilience costs going forward. So those can really be well understood in terms of relating the cost into a rate structure. Plant hydraulic gradient, I talked a little bit about that. That's kind of a standalone study. Pump station replacement benefit cost, I think you kind of asked a question sort of along those lines. We have two candidates. I think I kept it here as a placeholder, but I kind of think, even though they're old, there've been a lot invested in them, and we're probably more likely going to try and keep them and work
The
around.
ones that are in your vulnerable areas are relatively new.
Yeah, except for Sand Hills.
Sand
It's
Hills.
a 66 plant.
Okay.
But I think it's had a lot of improvements. And so, a very long-term objective is to take a closer look at this constructed wetland issue, because I do think it's a practical, it's a feel-good. I don't know, it's certainly not a near-term risk reduction, but it's past the first sort of test that it is practical enough that it is worthy of looking at it more closely. And then all this has to go to sort of packages of design, construction plans, and permitting. So this is really what it's about. All this is really about, comes out of this slide here, and that is implementation. These are really sort of socioeconomic challenges. They're not engineering challenges so much. That's part of what they are, but not necessarily the most difficult part. The difficult part is really the political implementation, and the political implementation is really a process of developing consensus. In this case, within the town, we really should have dedicated, I would say dedicated planning groups that are have representation of the citizenry, representation of the town professionals, like Brad, and they have very clear objectives, and they meet regularly. And they become the intermediary group with the Board of Selectmen. It's the Board of Selectmen that starts the process, along with, in certain cases, town votes, for actually implementing actionable changes. So putting that political implementation is really, in our experience, the hard part of doing this. So the communities, Brad and I were talking earlier, for example, we're talking about the communities that can thrive in a sort of changing climate environment, particularly with coastal flooding issues, are going to be the communities that sort of can get their planning and fiscal house under control. So you're not put into spending money in a reactionary case. You can do it in a more planned phase. So even individual homeowners can start planning their own personal budgets around certain rates to start implementing some of these improvements. But these improvements are not abstract. They're, if you want to flush the toilet, basically you got to do these types of things going forward. But so all of that political implementation, ultimately leads to sort of the governance and the administration, and that in turn leads to cost recovery. And so Ty and Bond has done it's a fairly detailed study on revenue structure, what the operating expenses are, what the non-operational expenses are, what that turns out, where's that money coming from, how should that money be, how should that be coming into the system, and what's a fiscally responsible approach to doing this. So when you look at revenue opportunities for a system like this, these systems are considered enterprise systems, meaning the users pay for the cost. That's the way enterprise systems, so you're not drawing from other funds. It's really the user is taking the burden of the system. So if you were a homeowner and you had to do an on-site system, your septic, which is 80% of the town, or plus or minus, you're completely responsible for that cost. You know, you want to pump out your septic tank, you get your wallet out basically. You want to put in a new system, you take your wallet out again or go to the bank or something. But you're fully responsible for that cost as a user.
I understand that. Are there climate adaptation funds being discussed at the state or federal level?
Yeah, so and Sam's going to bring a close. I was Sam talking about that. That's really sort of the grants, but the basic point I wanted to get off is it's a user-funded. It's set up financially as a user-funded system, which means the money coming in should pay for the costs going out. So that's typically for this type of, for water wastewater. I mean, that's the way it's traditionally done. We see this user-based, in the climate adaptation world that we're in, we see this user-based concept being expanded to non-typical things like stormwater. So we see communities starting to institute taxes or use fees tied to stormwater related to, runoff going into the street. So that's like not considered a traditional, I'm not quote using that stormwater, but you're creating that stormwater. So it's really intended to put a cost to that to change behavior. Like I'm going to invest in a porous pavement for my driveway, so I don't have to pay that cost. That's the way it works. So here's your opportunities. Grants, which is what you were asking about. So right now, there are primarily state grants. Sam will talk about those in detail. The funding in Massachusetts within those grant programs is not adequate today to cover the actual costs associated with these types of risks in all the communities in Massachusetts. So it's the type of thing that absolutely go after it. Why not? It's there. It's trying to distribute the cost to all the taxpayers of Massachusetts, at least people that buy property anyway. And you can be the recipient of that. But you're not going to solve all your problems counting on that. So that's not going to be the end all or the wherewithal, but it is something that we go after, and we set all of these things I've showed you so they will fit nicely into the grant program in Massachusetts. Certain things are federal grants, like related to elevated houses and stuff like that, but and there are some Army programs. There are some other federal grants, but primary source right now is in Massachusetts, state programs. Rates, they're an obvious. Sewer connection fees, that's a big source of revenue right now. That should not be the top source of revenue for the system, but I think it's a pretty big factor. You have general budget, that's the general town budget, covering operating expenses. I mean, if you have operating expenses related specifically to the wastewater treatment plant, and 20% of the town use it, 100% of the town's paying for that. And they're just building that into the budget. Most things like capital investments are done through bonds, and then using rates, increases, and things like that to pay the bond, to pay the note off. Fines, right? There's a potential for that. If you have a pretty solid financial system, like if you did everything time on said, you'd actually start accruing interest on retained earnings, which is kind of nice. It's sort of where you want to be in an operating system. You don't want to be getting rich off the users, but you want to start to be earning enough, sort of have enough sort of in your base fund to support that. And then you are going to expand the system. So that, why did I put that under cost recovery? And all it's going to do is cost money, because it actually creates a new opportunity window for to rethink the whole
More users, you mean?
Yeah. You have a whole new bunch of customers, basically. And then the third piece of this, which is very important for a lot of climate adaptation things in municipality, but it's so important here, is this sort of regulatory piece. So you do have believe it or not, you do have Article 11.1, which, if it were to be enforced, it's fairly open, would put a regulatory requirement on mitigating infiltration on your property. Look at that. But I don't think it's enforced. In fact, I don't think most people know about it. So, Sam, why don't you just close this out and I'll take your final questions with these grant programs.
Okay. So again, this is the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. It's a recent, promulgated program in Massachusetts that is designed to fund communities that are certified by the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. As Dan noted, this isn't going to solve all of the problems in Scituate or all of the communities combined. The Executive Order 569 that brought about this program, Governor Baker sets aside about $2.4 billion over 10 years. You can see that right here. About $500 million will be set aside for climate change. To give you some perspective, Scituate was one of the first communities to be certified. And when we were working with Brad and Will a couple years ago to, really kind of go after this, there were maybe 8 communities that were certified at that time, I think, right, Brad? Mm-hmm. Today, there's well over 100, and there's 351 communities throughout Massachusetts. This just isn't focused on coastal communities, because let's face it, there's other issues that can be impacted by climate change, such as drought, those type of factors, extreme heat. But we just want to give you some perspective that it's going to become increasingly competitive. This past year, grant cycle, there were $26 million in applicants, and the state had $10.1 million. So, but that's not to stop this program from being a key, avenue for, going after improvements to pump stations and other aspects of the system. The point is, you're going to have to take advantage of several of the other items that Dan noted, as far as bonds, rate increases, etc. But we just wanted to kind of give you a flavor of the Massachusetts program because it's so new, and pretty much all of the measures that we've identified are going to be eligible within that program. Speaker DeLeo has also set aside $1 billion focused on climate adaptation, so that bumps it up to 3.4 total. But all of that money doesn't technically go towards grants. There's also several kind of set-asides that are integrated for improvements throughout Massachusetts. And then to kind of take it home, this Resilience Massachusetts Action Team, they've really developed a statewide vulnerability assessment. Well, this piece right here. So really, this is kind of the key piece so the state was the first in the United States to create a natural hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan in 2018 that was approved. I think this is what this is focused on, which there was a Resilience Massachusetts Action Team that is really responsible for kind of using a geospatial tool to help communities in terms of having a better understanding of available grants that can assist communities in terms of identifying funding opportunities in the future that can really make communities more resilient.
So it's really about, also it's about bringing the state-owned properties, bring resilience into those. So there are some federal programs too that have been around for a while, but they are applicable to wastewater treatment. So you obviously want to take advantage of every grant opportunity that you can, and we wouldn't discourage if I could support you writing those applications. But you can't count on that as being your solution. So,
I think it really can serve as your catalyst though, like today, without this grant, this study would not have been possible. So I think it really, serves as setting up your future priorities for going after different actions. And I think the larger the dollar amount, probably the less likely some of these grants will be available because they have certain funding limits, up to $2 million. So some of the larger expenditure items, and we help communities try to find avenues to use bonds and those types of financial mechanisms to make those improvements in the long term.
Yeah, so what we got tonight and a few weeks ago in the first meeting was kind of the tip of the iceberg. There's a 250-page report that goes into a lot of detail. And I think, again, this process was enabled by that grant program. And now we know, so that when the town, the selectmen, voters, the residents, when we want to implement a project, we now have a resource to go back to and say, okay, we've mapped the entire system. We know at what point each component is vulnerable, and we can do kind of a stepwise or a logical kind of investment in those things. Some of the things that they mentioned might be 20 years out. And we might say between now and then we do or we don't want to do that. But it's really easy to put a flood-proof door on if we have another bad storm a year from now. And then it gives us the time to kind of think through some of the longer-term items. And we are going to ask them to go back before the selectmen, literally maybe just the last few slides to say, we did the study, we did the vulnerability assessment, we have this bigger report, but it boils down to decisions that your board will have to make, key kind of investments in the future of the plant and the collection system. So just to get it on their radar, because again, we are going to chase after every grant opportunity we can, but we want to do it pursuant to a plan that's really looked at this in some detail, rather than just kind of going for every opportunity kind of willy-nilly. So I think this really provides a great kind of roadmap for us to make those investments, again, whether it be state funded or otherwise.
and the implementation part isn't unique to the water and wastewater. Those are just two components. The town, typical of all our coastal communities, the town's going to face continuing issues that are related to climate adaptation. These are just some of them. But the key is to have a political system that supports that process. And by political, I'm not talking about Trump or something like that. I'm talking really about your local governance and the citizenry that gets involved in sort of task forces, that works to that. But you have to have the ability to institute actions. And if you're going to do a rate increase, you have to do that fairly, but you have to be able to successfully do it. Because kicking the can down won't help you, so it'll only cost more.
I would think as a taxpayer and a voter and a user of the sewer system that I'm happy that the town is thinking about wastewater treatment and water and the things that benefit each and every citizen of Scituate. So I would hope and think that there'd be a little bit more support behind this than some of the other things we've had to vote on recently in the town meeting.
And this is kind of the roadmap that will help, not just grants, because having worked for FEMA for several years and managed tens of millions of dollars in grant applications, I can say if you have an action that's clearly defined in a study or a plan that's got substantiated by the best available data, that's going to be much more likely to be funded, not just for grants, but also to help in terms of your capital budget planning. Because you clearly have identified A, B, and C being top priorities. You have a cost associated with it. You have a population base associated with it. So it can help guide the town as opposed to, there's hazard mitigation plans I've read where they have vulnerable systems, but they don't even address actions that to make improvements. And that makes it much more difficult when you don't have that roadmap.
Well, thank you for doing the
Yeah,
presentation
thank you.
tonight. It'll be the report when it's available, and both presentations will be on the Planning and Development website in the town. And we will work to schedule a time, again, to do a summary presentation to the selectmen. So if you have any questions, feel free to give me a call. My information is not on here, but I'm Brad Washburn, Planning and Development. I'm all over the website. My email and phone number are on there, but if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.